Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's lecture on the Epic of Gilgamesh. More than 4,000 years ago, in what's today the nation of Iraq, people were working on versions of this poem about the greatest hero that the world had ever seen, King Gilgamesh of Uruk, 1/3 man, 2/3 god, tyrant, traveler, and tragic figure. He who continues to speak to us to this day, reflecting eternal values of love and friendship, courage, fear, and acceptance of death. We'll learn about this work of world literature from the leading scholar on the subject, the distinguished Professor Babylonian Dr. Andrew George of the Department of Languages and Cultures of the Near and Middle East at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Professor George is author of the critical 2-volume omnibus edition of the Gilgamesh epic that now anchors all studies of the text on rock-solid ground, as well as a prize-winning translation made available to the general public on his own insistence through Penguin Classics and the Folio Society. Many of you are probably already familiar with it. It constitutes the most up-to-date and reliable translation of the text into any language. Professor George has his training from the University of Birmingham, where he completed his doctoral dissertation on Babylonian topographical texts under the supervision of W.G. Lambert in 1985. Since 1983, he has taught Akkadian and Sumerian language and literature at the School of African and Oriental Studies, the other way around, Oriental and African Studies in London. He is a fellow of the British Academy and an honorary member of the American Oriental Society and has so far authored 9 books and more than 110 scholarly articles, several of them on tonight's topic. Following the lecture, we are fortunate to have with us an illustrious panel of 3 professors who call Harvard their home and who have all themselves worked on various aspects of the epic at one point or another. Each has agreed to offer a 5-minute perspective on a topic of their choice as a comment to Professor George's lecture. The panel consists of former William Dorr Boardman Professor of Fine Arts, Dr. Irene Winter, Hancock Professor of Hebrew and other Oriental Languages, Dr. Peter Machinist, and Ernst Birnbaum Professor of Comparative Literature, Dr. David Damrosch. Following their remarks, we will open the discussion to the audience for questions and comments. This evening's event has been organized in collaboration with a lot of institutions, as you just heard, and particularly we are grateful to the Provost Hill Fund for the Arts and Humanities who has made this possible. The background is a course for the Harvard College, A&E 103 Ancient Lives, whose 70 students have spent the afternoon with our guest, asking questions and leading discussions in preparation for their main course assignment this year, a live performance of selected parts of the epic under the sound guidance of their instructor from the American Repertory Theatre, Brennan Isley. Our lecture tonight is thus also part of a learning activity for our students on how to think about and deal with key aspects of human nature and historical development over a long span of time, and it will form an element in their interactive engagement with course topics through a personal and sensory experience with the past. As you heard, for those of you who have the time, you will also have a chance to share in this sensory journey for the following event, which will occur immediately after this lecture at the Semitic Museum. You're invited to tour the galleries and have some Mesopotamian culinary nibbles, or rather, at least its closest proxy, which is Watertown, Massachusetts. And, if you are 21, to sample the wine that we have imported from the mountains where Gilgamesh and Enkidu slew Humbaba, as well as beer brewed according to ancient recipes from Phrygia. So whether you will be joining us in the Semitic Museum or not, I welcome you and hope that you will join me in welcoming our main speaker for the evening, Professor Andrew George.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's wonderful to be here. I'm very, very happy to have been invited to address you. It's wonderful to see an almost full house, and let me express my gratitude also to the people who brought me here, the institutions who've helped do that, and to Dr. Barjamovic for the invitation that he sent me some months ago. I'm going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, Gilgamesh, subtitled The Recovering the Masterpiece of Babylonian Literature, because that's what it is. But first of all, we do have to ask ourselves the question, what is Gilgamesh? Because Gilgamesh is, well, pretty much everywhere. There is a book by Theodore Ziolkowski of the University of Princeton that explains what I've just said, that Gilgamesh has really entered the artistic consciousness of the West, of modern Iraq, of Europe, of North America, because since about 1912, when the first translation into a modern language was achieved that was reliable, artists, poets, musicians, dramatists, operettists, librettists have fed on the ancient story of Gilgamesh and turned it into their own property, which is only right. That they could do so is a sign of the humanity and importance of the ancient epic. And I hope that by the time we get to the end of my talk, it will emerge why this particular text, the Epic of Gilgamesh, 4,000 years old as it is, has had this profound influence on modern Western culture. Because I think it's fair to say that after the Bible, no other ancient Near Eastern text has been as influential on the modern world as Gilgamesh has. And so far as I know, while the Bible is a scripture and has that help of being a scripture, there is not yet any sect anywhere in the world that considers the Epic of Gilgamesh to be scripture. Though I may be wrong, of course. So Gilgamesh then is a 4,000-year-old Babylonian poem. And I thought of 5 ways that we can approach Gilgamesh, this old poem. We're going to talk then about the story. We're going to talk about archaeology and decipherment. We're going to talk about how the poem is reconstructed from all those bits that I will show you. Something about poetry to get a measure of the aesthetics of the text. And then, well, does it mean anything to us 4,000 years later? Is there a message in this ancient poem? First of all then, the story, to give you the backbone that you need to listen to the rest. We should know what the poem says. Well, we divide it up into several chunks, and the first chunk introduces Gilgamesh, king in Uruk. Uruk, an ancient city in the south of Babylonia, now Iraq. He was an imposing giant figure, kingly, heroic, glorious. And I'm afraid the best reputation that we've got of him from the ancient world is none of those things. Here it is. We know it's Gilgamesh because he's standing on top of the head of one of his slaughtered enemies. Gilgamesh was king, but he was a tyrant. He was an autocrat who had his own way and abused his rights as a king. And it's interesting that the Babylonian poet does not seek to turn this greatest of kings and most glorious of heroes into a one-dimensional hero. He turns him instead into a human being. He's a tyrant, this man, because he's been given power and he uses it absolutely. And the gods listen to the complaints of the town of Uruk, and they send a wild man down who is in every respect the image of Gilgamesh, except that where Gilgamesh is a man of the city, Enkidu, and that is his name, is a man of the wild. The poet has to find a way of bringing Enkidu to the city to meet Gilgamesh so that he can divert his superhuman energies and stop him abusing his people. And this is done through a sequence of events involving the seduction of Enkidu by a prostitute, his humanization, turning from an animal into a man, and his socialization, first of all, in the shepherd's camp, where he learns to eat and drink like a human being and is clothed, and then his humanization into society, his socialization in the city itself. So Enkidu comes to Uruk, the city of Gilgamesh, fully intent on teaching Gilgamesh a lesson because he's heard about Gilgamesh's tyranny, and like all instinctive beings, he has a feeling of unfairness. You know, it seems to me that even small children understand the concept of fairness intuitively, and Gilgamesh falls into that, Enkidu falls into that category. He meets Gilgamesh determined to stop his abuse. They fight, they struggle, they come to a standstill. Neither is the winner, but they recognize in each other a bosom friend, and that is what they become and remain. Enkidu and Gilgamesh team up, And they leave town to go on an adventure to the cedar forest where the ogre Humbaba, there he is on the left, a representation probably of Humbaba with his wrinkly face, who guards the cedar forest over in Lebanon. Gilgamesh and Enkidu resolve to go there, to do him to death, and to fell his cedars and bring them back to Uruk. And so they do. And here is an old Babylonian plaque depicting Gilgamesh and Enkidu slaughtering Humbaba, the tree monster, in his forest before they cut down the cedars. And that is their first glorious expert of heroism. The second one is when they come back to Uruk after defeating Humbaba and chopping down his cedars. And Ishtar, the goddess of Uruk, is so impressed with the beauty of Gilgamesh that she falls in love with him, if she can fall in love, and that is a difficult proposition for a goddess like Ishtar, who is, in fact, a prostitute. She is attracted by his physique, his manliness, his beauty, and she proposes to him that he marry her. And he says, no fool would marry, no one but a fool would marry a prostitute like you. Look at what's happened to your previous lovers. They've all come unstuck. I will have nothing to do with you. And she, as the goddess of his town, Uruk, is absolutely insulted by that and runs up to her father in heaven and says, give me, Father, the bull of heaven with which to teach Gilgamesh and Enkidu a lesson. And if you don't, I shall scream so loud that the dead will arise from the netherworld and eat the living. The first, I think, occasion in human literature where zombies have been brought into play. Well, the zombies are something that her father doesn't want to have walking around the earth. He'd rather they stay in the netherworld, and he gives to his daughter the bull of heaven, the constellation Taurus, a fiery bull in the sky. She brings it down to Uruk, where it causes much damage, but in the end, of course, Gilgamesh and Enkidu defeat it and slay it, as you can see on this rather wretched clay plaque now in Berlin. And that is the point of the greatest achievement of this pair. They have slaughtered an ogre in the cedar forest, and they have slaughtered the bull of heaven. But neither is a completely, unambiguously glorious thing to have done, because the ogre was placed in the cedar forest to protect the cedar by the gods. And the bull of heaven, well, is the bull of heaven, also belonging to the gods. And while they are having a banquet in the palace after these events, the gods are in council, and Enkidu lies down to sleep, and he witnesses the council in a dream. And the gods determine that because these two heroes have behaved badly, overstepped the mark, one of them shall die, and the one that shall die shall be Enkidu. And so Enkidu falls sick, and after a long illness, in which he is partly raving and having dreams of the netherworld, he dies. And there is then a long epic funeral, only recently recovered. I think that's a desideratum in all funerals, in at least the ancient Mediterranean and the ancient Near East, all epics in the ancient Mesopotamian and the ancient Near East, that you have to have a good funeral. All the grave goods are recounted and duly set up before the gods, in order that Enkidu, when he gets to the netherworld, finds that the gods are on his side. And this is represented, this episode, by a grave at Abu Salabih, showing a dead human being, not certainly Enkidu, in fact, not at all Enkidu. And on the right, some crushed jewellery from Ur of the Chaldees, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, in the great grave pit there, the Royal Cemetery of Ur, which neatly demonstrates the richness of royal graves. Certainly Enkidu's grave was a rich one. Now, Enkidu was Gilgamesh's lover. They loved each other. And the death of Enkidu brings about a huge change in Gilgamesh. He has lost the human he loved most in all the world. And this drives him crazy, not just because he's lost his friend, but also because he suddenly understands that death is real. And he fears for himself. What grows in him is a horror of death, because he knows that he too, like Enkidu, will die. And he's driven to go on a mad quest to the ends of the earth to seek the secret of immortality, because he knows that far away somewhere beyond the ends of the earth there still lives an ancestor of his who was once king in Sumer, a different city, not Uruk, but not far away, but who still lives thousands of years later and is in fact immortal. And Gilgamesh reasons that if there is one human who became immortal, perhaps he could do that as well and get what he wants, an evasion of his own death. And so he sets out for the ends of the earth, and in the end he gets there. He's taken across the waters of death into the presence of Utnapishti, his ancestor, who lives immortal beyond the end of the world with his wife. And Utnapishti explains to him the fact of his own immortality, the fact that this immortality was given to him by the gods because they didn't know what else to do with him when Utnapishti survived the great flood long ago in human history, when the gods resolved to wipe out mankind and nearly succeeded, except that one among their number told Utnapishti to build an ark, get all his family aboard, all the seeds of living things. Yes, it's the story of Noah, but it's the Babylonian original. Utnapishti tells this story to Gilgamesh and says, I'm immortal because the gods didn't know what to do after that with me, so they put me on this island far away and gave me immortality like them, but that's not going to happen for you. You can't become immortal as I have, because it was a one-off solution to a one-off event. But why don't you try and stay awake for a week? Just to show, just to demonstrate whether you're even ready to conquer death. See whether you can conquer sleep. Gilgamesh, who has been traveling for months and months without having a wink of sleep, says, of course I can do that, and immediately falls asleep. And it's demonstrated to him by the fact that he hasn't eaten for 7 days, the food that's been put for him, that he has slept for a week, and he is distraught. And he realizes then, he begins to realize, that he's not going to become immortal any time soon. In fact, not at all. So Utnapishti sends him on his way home, having failed in his quest for immortality, but tells him where he can get some kind of compensation. Not immortality, but a plant that, if he eats it, will make him young again, a plant of rejuvenation. And Gilgamesh dives to the bottom of the ocean, plucks the plant, but he doesn't trust what he's been told. He's very human, is Gilgamesh, as we'll find out. And he says, I'll put this in my belt and take it home to Uruk, and when I get there, I'll try it out on a young man, and if the young man gets young again, then I'll know it works, and I'll take some myself. So he goes home, and on the way, just before getting to Uruk, there's a nice pool, and he's tired and dirty and hot. And so he puts his things by the side of the pool and goes in for a dip. One of the things he puts beside the pool is the plant of rejuvenation. And a snake, sniffing the fine scent of the plant, wriggles out from where it had been hiding, picks up the plant of rejuvenation in its mouth, and wriggles away again. And as it wriggles away, it sheds its skin. And at that point, Gilgamesh knows two things. He knows, first of all, that what Utnapishti had told him about the properties of this plant was true. But he also knows that he himself, having had this plant in his hands, has now lost it for good and has failed completely. And with that, he goes home. And that's the end of the story. Now, with that story, firmly embedded in your memories, we'll go a bit further and look at the archaeology and decipherment of Gilgamesh, this 4,000-year-old narrative poem in Babylonian. And we'll ask two particular questions. Where do the sources of the poem come from? And who deciphered and published them? These are actually longer stories than they might be, or than you might expect. And it really begins in the 19th century when Austin Henry Layard, the gentleman on the left there in Bakhtiari dress, who was a gentleman adventurer, set out for Ceylon from London and didn't get there. He got to Mesopotamia, as it was then called, and he was fascinated in the ruin mounds that he saw all around him in northern Mesopotamia. One of them in particular, which was opposite the modern city of Mosul, across the Tigris. Mosul, the town that even now the Iraqi army is preparing to take back from the Islamic State in the north of Iraq. And here's a map of Mosul in 1852, and you can see opposite it a great walled enclosure, which is the ancient city of Nineveh. And within that walled enclosure, you can see two citadels, one here and one here. This is where Austin Henry Layard started to dig, because he thought these mounds, the local people say, are the ruins of ancient cities. I'm not going to go to Ceylon, I'm going to investigate these ancient cities. He dug at Nimrud first and then came back to Mosul and started digging here at this citadel mound. And on this photograph from the 1930s, you can still see the pits in the surface of the mound where he dug. Here is the Tigris flowing from the north to the south, and Mosul across the river as it was then. Later by 1989, you'd see that the city has encroached upon this flat land here, and this photograph on the right is taken from the city wall here. You can see the city wall stretching to this great mound where Layard dug in the distance. And what Layard found there was a palace of an Assyrian king called Sennacherib, the one who besieged Jerusalem in Kings. And he dug tunnels in the mound, and he found the remains of a monumental palace building, and he could follow the corridors and the chambers, the walls of the corridors and the chambers, because they were lined with great bas-relief monuments, great limestone slabs with pictorial scenes upon them and some writing, as you can see here in this lithograph, surrounding lining the walls of this particular chamber. And maybe some of you have been to the British Museum and seen these slabs. They were what attracted Mesopotamian archaeologists first and foremost to digging these mounds in Assyria, these wonderful bas-reliefs depicting the might of the Assyrian army and its conquests, and other wonderful things like the lion hunts of Ashurbanipal. But in this very building, in this very chamber here, there was, according to Layard, and here he is sitting in Western dress, drawing the bas-reliefs on these monuments, there was a mound of clay tablets, knee-deep, he said. And these clay tablets he couldn't read, but he recognized that they were covered in what was called cuneiform writing, and he sent them back to the British Museum in 1850 and another batch in 1853, and they became the foundation of the science of Assyriology, because they were tablets from Assyria. So the discipline which is interested in deciphering cuneiform in Mesopotamia is called Assyriology. Assyriology got nowhere fast because there wasn't anyone in the British Museum who could cope with 20,000 tablets of cuneiform writing until 1866, when a young man called George Smith was employed to start making sense of these things. But let's have a look at what they look like. This is a tablet of Gilgamesh from that pile of tablets in that room in Sennacherib's palace. It actually belongs to Sennacherib's grandson, Ashurbanipal. It has a label here saying, property of Ashurbanipal, king of the world, king of Assyria. But it's a manuscript of Gilgamesh, tablet 6, the episode when Gilgamesh and Enkidu defeat the Bull of Heaven. I've also illustrated here, from a different time, a different period, a different place, a mound of tablets to show you that when clay tablets fall from shelves, as they're typically stored on, they break on the floor. And you can see that this one is also broken, not only the two parts that you can see there, but also the bit that's missing, because originally this would have had 3 columns of text, 1, 2, 3, but the third column has almost gone. And that's a perennial problem besetting Assyriologists, that we work with broken sources. Now, George Smith, employed in 1866 to make sense of all these tablets, was an extraordinary Assyriologist. He was the first man to draw a salary as an Assyriologist, because he was paid by the British Museum only to work on cuneiform tablets. In 150 years ago, so I reckon he's the first salaried Assyriologist. And after a few years, he discovered all sorts of wonderful things. You can still see the marks on the tablets: M for mythology in pencil, H for historical, and R for religious. And among the M mythological tablets were tablets about a hero that he called Izdubar. We now call him Gilgamesh. And he discovered that there was a narrative of the flood in the Izdubar legends, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and he gave a paper on it to the Society of Biblical Antiquaries, is that right? No, the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London, and it caused a complete sensation, because this was very clearly a narration of the flood story that was closely related to this story in Genesis, the story of Noah. But it wasn't complete. The Babylonian story in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Izdubar as Smith called it, bits were missing, so the Daily Telegraph provided 1,000 guineas for George Smith to go out to Iraq and to find the missing piece, as if it was as easy as that. But he did actually go to Nineveh twice, and he did find a missing piece of the flood story, believe it or not. Not actually Gilgamesh, though he didn't know that at the time, but another flood story embedded in another long narrative poem of mythological content. That was so successful that the Daily Telegraph said, "Job achieved, come home immediately." But he went back and bought a lot of tablets in Baghdad, and these were not Assyrian tablets from the north, from Mosul. They were from the south, and they were a different kind of tablet, slightly later in a different script, but the same body of material. That's to say, there were Gilgamesh tablets in there, and the British Museum set about buying these things. They were excavated by the ordinary people in the mounds of Iraq for commercial reasons. The local people sensed that there was a market for these things. George Smith had bought some, so they started digging them up wherever they could find them and selling them to the British Museum, and the British Museum bought 20,000. They later sent Hormuzd Rassam, an Assyrian Christian who had helped Laird at Nineveh, to conduct his own excavations in the south, in these cities around about Baghdad, just south of Baghdad, including Babylon. And Rassam brought back another 50,000 Babylonian tablets. So by this time there were 90,000 tablets in the British Museum and 2 people who could read them. And it's still a bit like that. Assyriology is beset by 2 problems: vast quantities of tablets, something like 500,000 in the museums of the world, and a tiny number of people who can decipher them. So, in this way, we ensure that Assyriology will last forever. Because we're still trying to even work on the first 10% of that 500,000. But back to Gilgamesh. What happened to these tablets, the tablets that George Smith had identified as Gilgamesh, is that a young German in his 30s came to the British Museum and copied them, made line drawings of the cuneiform. All of them. What he didn't do is translate them. So that wasn't much good, except if you could read cuneiform. And as I've said, only 2 people could. But slowly, scholars worked through this material and made it more available, and more stuff kept turning up. So in 1930, Campbell Thompson, an Oxford Assyriologist, published an edition of the Epic of Gilgamesh that included 112 tablets and fragments, mainly from Nineveh, from Layard's original find, a few late Babylonian tablets from Rassam's acquisitions that had been processed and recognized, only a few. We're talking 2 or 3, and that's 70,000 tablets. Some old Babylonian tablets, which were much, 1,000 years older than the Kuyunjik stuff, than the Assyrian tablets, they had begun to emerge on the market as the people began to dig through the mounds. They got stuff not only from the first millennium BC, but also tablets from much older time. And elsewhere, not only in Mesopotamia, but also in Turkey, tablets were turning up, so Campbell Thompson was able to make use of one Gilgamesh tablet from Anatolia. But the story is a process of accrual, of aggregation. There's much more. So when I came to repeat the work of Campbell Thompson in 2003, there were 217 sources extant, 184 from the first millennium, the Neo-Assyrian manuscripts from Kuyunjik, and the late Babylonian manuscripts from the south of this place, or south of the country, but also 33 much older tablets between 4,000 and 3,000 years old. And my part in this has been one of a succession of Assyriologists who are pioneers in deciphering tablets, of reconstructing the literature of ancient Mesopotamia. We stand on each other's shoulders. I am only the most recent person to do Gilgamesh. There will be someone coming later who will continue the work and do more of it, find more of it, decipher more of it, and present a better edition. So, as I say, pioneering work, but a constant aggregation of new manuscripts and new knowledge means that we get more and more of this 4,000-year-old epic poem. And just to illustrate the fact that new material keeps turning up and fills the gaps, here's a news article from the London Times from 2015. We've got 226 sources now, still rising. Last one discovered only last year. Here's a tablet that was found in Sulaymaniyah Museum. A lot of the work of identifying tablets occurs not in archaeology, but in museums, where still have vast quantities of uncatalogued collections of clay tablets to sift through. And this piece was identified in Sulaymaniyah Museum in the Kurdish regional government-controlled part of Iraq in 2012, and a colleague and I published it shortly afterwards, and then it hit the media in 2015, where you can see this piece here, even got coverage in a daily newspaper, and then got commented on by bloggers. And here's a wonderful blog from the History blog. A gentleman called Bort. Bort says he discovered there were new passages of Gilgamesh, and he's a bit worried about that. So he tells everyone, for the love of all that's good in the world, don't read the new passages out loud. That's how the old ones are summoned. Or so I've heard. Well, at least don't try to read them in the native tongue, okay? I don't know if that which shan't be named understands English, but that which shan't be named certainly understands Babylonian, in his mind. Well, I hope Bort's not here, because we're going to read some later in the original Babylonians. So, all these bits I've explained that have been discovered in archaeological excavation and in museums, what do we do with them as Assyriologists in order to reconstruct the poem? Well, I'll just give you an idea of what happens. Tablets come out in small pieces. Here's a bunch of tablets, not Gilgamesh tablets, but never mind. You can see the extent of the problem. They're made of sun-dried clay, not baked usually, but sun-dried, so they're very fragmentary, particularly once you expose them and get them out of the matrix of earth in which they rest. They very, very rapidly deteriorate unless they're conserved. And here's a workman at Nippur in the 1950s painstakingly getting out a tablet from the bulk here with a paintbrush and a little knife to free it with. So it's difficult work and very fragile work getting these things out of the ground archaeologically, and then there are the problems of conservation. But here is a very famous Gilgamesh tablet, the Floods tablet, one of the ones that George Smith identified in the 1870s. What we do with them is we make line drawings of what are essentially three-dimensional objects, and here is my line drawing of this column of that tablet there. And then we find that because the literature of ancient Mesopotamia was essentially canonical, belong to a stream of tradition in which people kept on writing out the same stuff, you get multiple witnesses to the same text. And Gilgamesh is no exception. We get passages where there are 4 or 5 different sources for a set of lines. Some passages we don't have any sources for, but that's the other side of the coin. And these sources are fragmentary, but what we can do is use the different surviving bits to put together the text that they both hold on them. So it's a kind of jigsaw puzzle, but using fragments of different jigsaws. But since that's the same picture, you eventually achieve a reconstructed text. Now, if you take a look here, this is the bottom of the column of the flood tablet down here, there. And this is another manuscript of the same flood tablet. And if you look very carefully, you can see that signs here are replicated here. There's ut, and there's ut, and there's iba, and there's ba, and there's uhammatu, and there's the end of uhammatu there, and there's dipa, and there's dipa there. You can see that it's the same sign. So we've got 2 different witnesses to the same part of the text, and what we do with them, having drawn them, is we can transliterate them into Roman script because the script is nicely deciphered, and there you can see the ut, and here's the ibau bit, and there's the uhammatu bit, and there's the dipa bit, singly by manuscript. Then we can put those together so that we get a combined manuscript, and it's beginning to look like text that you can use, and indeed then we can turn it into language, because the great thing about this script is it has vowels as well as consonants, and here we get something that we can read out, if Bort will allow us, and if he's here, please, he could leave. Tarkulli erakali nassach illak ninurta mikhri ushardi, annunnaki ishu diparati, ina namririshanu hammatumatu, sha'adad shuharassu ibau shame, mimanamru anada ummati uttaru. And that's the Babylonian. I don't know whether a Babylonian would understand that, but when Assyriologists talk to each other, they can understand it. And then you can translate, and we get this translation here. It's the point in the story where Utnapishti is telling Gilgamesh about the flood that he experienced so long ago, a first-person account of the flood, and he tells this, he paints this lovely picture of the onset of the storm that caused the flood. The god Erakal was uprooting the mooring poles. Ninurta passing by made the weirs overflow. The Anunnaki gods carried torches of fire, lightning, scorching the country with brilliant flashes. The stillness of the storm god passed over the sky, and all that was bright then turned into darkness. So this process of deciphering fragments, of identifying the text on them, of putting text together from different fragments and finally getting lines that can be translated, goes on and on for every part of Gilgamesh, and indeed for every Babylonian narrative poem and all other literary compositions that are part of the stream of tradition that the Babylonians passed down and the Assyrians passed down. And gradually through this process, being conducted by a very few people around the world, we are recovering the oldest literatures in human history. The Babylonian literature, the Sumerian literature before it. But it's painstaking work. It's very rewarding work. And we begin, because we can understand this poetry, not only to hear it aesthetically, but we begin also to analyze it and see how it's structured. And Babylonian poetry is rather carefully structured. Each line is usually a statement or 2 statements. We haven't got long sentences that go on forever. I was reading Charlotte Bronte's Villette the other day, and there's a sentence in there which goes on for a page and a half. But you can't do that in Babylonian poetry. A sentence will normally stop at the end of the line, or at the most go on to 2 lines, but very often a line is 2 statements. But the first and the second statements kind of support each other. So we see here, this is about what happens when the storm hits the rivers it uproots the mooring poles, and the weirs overflow. And then we get the lightning gods coming, carrying lightning and scorching the country. And then we get the storm god, the calm before the storm. The stillness passed over the sky, and it all goes very dark. So the ideas are carefully separated in the poetry, and we move through it through a process of short statements, which often are bound together in pairs. And I want now to go on to have a look at the poet's art just with a couple more examples. This one is the seduction of Enkidu, and if you remember, the way that Enkidu was got from the wild into Uruk to become the chum, the friend of Gilgamesh, was he was seduced by a prostitute. And this is Akkadian. I won't read it, but you can see that I've made bold some nouns in it which are important in the way that the poetry is constructed. If we look at the translation, the same nouns are here also separated from the main text, but by colours. And this, again, is poetry which is carefully constructed so that the first two couplets are the coming together of these two people, Shamkhat the prostitute and Enkidu, to have sex together. The second set of two couplets, four-line passage, is actually the sexual intercourse. And then the third one, again, two couplets, has something else happening. So, in fact, we're seeing kind of verses. The interesting thing is that here, Shamkhat unfastened the cloth of her loins, she bared her sex, and he took in her charms, so she takes her clothes off. She did not recoil, she took in his scent, she spread her clothing, and he lay upon her. So they now come together on the ground, on her clothing. And then she did for the man the work of the woman, his passion caressed and embraced her. That's say the intercourse starts, and then it lasts for 6 days and 7 nights. Enkidu was erect as he coupled with Shamkhat. The way that the poet has organized the text is that Shamkhat occurs there and there, and Enkidu is sandwiched between, because his entire concentration, his mind, his senses, are all, at that point, concentrated upon the prostitute. So here he is, sandwiched between Shamkhat. And he hasn't a thought for anything else, a glance for anything else. He's absorbed entirely with the prostitute. But after the intercourse has stopped, when with her delights he was fully sated, he turned his gaze to his herd. These are the animals he grew up with in the wild. The gazelles saw Enkidu and started to run. The beasts of the field shied away from his presence. And if you look here again, Enkidu is sandwiched, this time, not by the prostitute, whom he's had enough of, but by the animals with whom he grew up. His herd, called here the beasts of the field as well. So it's a mark of a very careful poetic organization. And Babylonian poetry is like this. It's very formal. It has a particular way of telling narrative in short statements, but also more complex things happen, so that here we can see that the poet has thought very carefully about where to put the name of Enkidu. Not here, but here. An old Babylonian example is this tablet from the 18th century BC, joined from a piece in Berlin and a piece in the British Museum. They were put together in 1994 when they were allowed to kiss, just briefly, at a conference in Berlin. But then this piece went back into the pocket of the curator from London and was taken home again, and they are now divorced. But this is a passage in which Gilgamesh reaches the end of the world, and he meets an alewife who asks what he's doing, and he explains, I've got to go and see Utanapishti because I want to become immortal. Where is he? Can you help me get there? And she says, don't be silly. No one's ever done that. In any case, there are better things to do with your life than go on a mad quest for immortality. Why don't you make merry each day, dance and play day and night? Let your clothes be clean. Let your head be washed. May you bathe in water. Gaze on the little one who holds your hand. Let a woman enjoy your repeated embrace. For such is the destiny. The text now runs out, but it must be of mortal men. And the fourth line of this verse, the second line of this couplet, is lost. But again, we can see in play, the ideas come in two-line couplets here. Make merry, dance and play. Keep nice and clean. Enjoy the company of your family, for that's what you've got to do. Good advice. And this is actually one of the most famous bits, I think, of Gilgamesh, not only because it's such a beautiful little picture of domestic harmony and simple living, wherein lie human happiness, but also because it's so like a passage in Ecclesiastes. Now, another thing I like about this is when it says, gaze on the little one who holds your hand, the Akkadian is Tsubi Sechram Sabitu Kartika. And I don't know whether I'm the only person in the world who thinks that in the sound Subbi and Sabitu, Subbi, Sabitu, there's little kissing noises, because you kiss your babies when you bounce them on your knee. So that we can, because we have the vowels and we have the words, we can understand and appreciate aesthetically the Gilgamesh epic. It's more than just a story. We can appreciate it as well, not just for what it tells us in terms of a narrative, but also in terms of the way it's structured and the sound of it, which is a wonderful thing to be able to do after 3,000 years. Now, the last avenue of approach to the Epic of Gilgamesh is to ask the question, does this old poem mean anything to a modern readership, a modern audience, 4,000, 3,000 years later? Good question, right? Well, this passage, which we've just seen, ends with this statement, such is the destiny of mortal men. So you understand here, already in the old Babylonian poem, and I haven't really properly explained that because of the nature of our discoveries of clay tablets, we have versions of the text from the old Babylonian period at the 4,000 years ago, as well as for much later from the Nineveh, which is 2,500 years ago. So we've got a history of the text as well as the extent of the poem to be considered. But in this old Babylonian episode, already the poet is saying, this is human destiny. There's a message going out here to the readership or the audience. This poet is telling you something about the human condition, that it's the duty of humans to make merry, to be clean, and to enjoy family life. That's what we're for. Well, this idea of a poet who wants to tell us about the human condition is very much more clear from the first millennium version of the poem, of which we've got much more. And it begins like this. We already begin to see the nature of the interest of this poet from the very beginning of the poem. And it starts like this. Shanakpa imuru ishtimati, al-kakati du kalama chassu. He who saw the deep, the country's foundation, who knew the proper ways, was wise in all matters. Gilgamesh, who saw the deep, the country's foundation, who knew the proper ways, was wise in all matters. Immediately you're familiar, this is Babylonian poetry, we're doing things 2 lines at a time, and here the second couplet is the same as the first, but with the name Gilgamesh chucked in. He explored everywhere the seats of power and learnt of everything the sum of wisdom. He saw what was secret, discovered what was hidden. He brought back a tale of before the deluge. So he went everywhere, learnt everything, including secret stuff from the most ancient period. That's the burden of the 2 couplets there. He came a far road. He went a long way. He went all over the world. Was weary, found peace. All his labours were set on a tablet of stone. And there's a change here from a very active hero, going everywhere, finding out stuff, going a long way, coming back, and suddenly everything goes non-active. He was weary. He found peace. And he didn't even himself write his labours on a tablet of stone. They were passively set there. It's as if he went on this long journey and then, having come home, he couldn't do anything more. He was exhausted. He'd just stopped. Which is interesting. It tells us a little bit about what we might expect in the poem. A story about a man who went on a long journey did everything, found out everything, but then stopped. The end of this prologue has an address to the reader or the audience, but in the singular. So the poet is talking to each and every one of us individually. It says, climb Uruk's wall and walk back and forth, survey its foundations, examine the brickwork. Were its bricks not fired in an oven? Did the 7 sages not lay its foundations? Typical Babylonian poetry again, 2 little couplets there, telling you what to do. You've got to climb up and have a look around this great city wall that Gilgamesh built. And it asks you these questions. It's old, isn't it? Very old, made of this expensive material, baked brick. And then you get this very strange statement, which is in prose. Now, Babylonian poets didn't put prose in their poetry, but this one did. And if he did it for a very good reason. So this is not kind of footnote. This is really very important, and we'll find out why in a moment. We go back to poetry. While walking around, on this wall, you've got to find a tablet box of cedar and release its clasps of bronze. Lift the lid of its secret, pick up the tablet of lapis lazuli, and read out. That's the end of the sequence of 4 lines arranged in the 2-line couplets. Find this thing, open up the lid, lift out the tablet, and read. And then there's a 5th line, which doesn't belong in the structure of the poem. It's extraneous. It's just as odd, this 5th line, as this bit of prose is here. And so I say this is important also, extra important, because it's disjunctive, it's breaking up the poem, and it's doing that because the poet wants you to pay special attention now, and the special attention to which you've got to pay is to this line, read out the travails of Gilgamesh, all that he went through. So now we see this is not a poem anymore about a hero who is glorious, a great king who undertakes heroic deeds. This is a poem about a person who went through hardship, the travails of Gilgamesh, all that he went through. And that is the end of the prologue. So everything that follows the story of Gilgamesh in this 1st millennium version of the poem, the standard Babylonian Gilgamesh, is expressed as the travails of Gilgamesh, as hardship. It was an epic career of pain. And when he gets there to the flood hero's island beyond the waters of death at the edge of the earth, Utnapishti, the flood hero, has things to say to him which might be said to all of us. There's a kind of sermon or homily. He says to Gilgamesh, what are you doing going on this mad quest? You look a mess. All your clothing's worn out. And you've abandoned your city and come out here, and you're a king. You're not supposed to be doing this stuff. And he tells him some home truths. Man is snapped off like a reed in a canebrake, he says. The comely young man, the pretty young woman, all too soon in their prime, death abducts them. And then there's an empty line. It's a kind of shocking void. You're supposed to sit up now. You sit up. My God, yes. We're thinking about death now. Well, Gilgamesh has been fleeing death. He doesn't want to think about death. He wants to avoid death. Death horrifies him. And so there's an empty space while it all sinks in. And Utnapishti goes on, he says, no one at all sees death, no one at all sees the face of death, no one at all hears the voice of death, death so savage who hacks men down. Yes, death is there, he tells Gilgamesh. And you won't see him, you won't hear him, but there he is. He is a fact of human existence. And Gilgamesh doesn't want to hear this. But Utnapishti continues. And he talks about human life in general, in terms of human families, the smallest human unit of human society. Ever, he says, do we build our households, ever do we make our nests, ever do brothers divide their inheritance, ever do feuds arise in the land. So life goes on, we start families, we have children. Then the brothers fall out over the inheritance and they are cross with each other and they don't talk. But the whole thing goes on again. It's ever, 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 ever. It all happens over and over again. But also what happens over and again is this stanza here. Ever the river has risen and brought us the flood. The mayfly floating on the water. There's a mayfly there. On the face of the sun its countenance gazes. Then all of a sudden, nothing is there. So there's a contrast here between the communal life of human beings, creating their families in a kind of cycle that goes on and on and on, and the individual mayfly that lasts but a moment before it disappears without trace. It sees the sun for a moment and is gone. The mayfly everywhere is a symbol of the brevity of human life. But first of all, in Gilgamesh. And then finally, Uttamapishti talks about human destiny. He says, the abducted and the dead, how alike is their lot, but never was drawn the likeness of death. Earlier he talked about death abducting human beings, but there's a difference between people who are kidnapped by the enemy and people who are dead, because you're never going to see the dead again. Never in the land did the dead greet a man. And there's another empty line there, another shocking void, as it sinks into Gilgamesh. The death is actually final. There's no coming back. And Uttamapishti explains, the Anunnaki, the great gods, held an assembly, and Mamitum, the mother goddess, maker of destiny, fixed fates with them. Both death and life they have established. But the day of death they do not disclose. And elsewhere we find that life is what the gods kept for themselves. Death is what they gave to mankind. So you're going to die, says Uttamapishti, and you don't know when. And it's final. It's final. And then we come to the end of the poem. A meditation on death, this poem turns out to be then. But it's not all gloom. At the end of the poem, Gilgamesh, having returned from Uttamapishti's island across the waters of death with his friend the ferryman, and having lost on the way the plant of rejuvenation, which was his last compensation, comes back to Uruk, his hometown, and he addresses his companion with these words. He says, "O Ur-Shanabi, climb Uruk's wall and walk back and forth." And we immediately find we're in a stanza we had before, right at the beginning, when the poet was asking each individual in his audience to climb Uruk's wall and walk back and forth. Survey its foundations, examine the brickwork. Were its bricks not fired in an oven? Did the seven sages not lay its foundations? A square mile is city, a square mile date grove, a square mile is clay pit, half a square mile the temple of Ishtar, 3 square miles and a half is Uruk's expanse. And that's that passage of prose again from the introductory prologue, coming up again at the end, and not just anywhere at the end, but at the very, very end. This is the end of the poem. It stops at that point with this passage of prose, which looks as if it's a footnote out of Baedeker or something like that. But again, I would say it's prose, and it's at the end, and the poet put it there deliberately. What on earth does he mean? There must be some message here for us. For a long time, Assyriologists thought the whole business was about the wall, that this was Gilgamesh's monument. And so it is. He built the wall, and you can still see it around Uruk, the site in southern Iraq, where Gilgamesh once lived. But the point at the bottom is neglected. It's a city, and it's made up of different things. City, date grove, clay pit, temple. What do these mean? Here they are. Uruk's expanse, city, date grove, clay pit, and temple. All taken from Babylon, but nevertheless. They symbolize something, I think. They symbolize the sum of human life. City is the dwelling houses where families procreate, live, continue over and over again, this cycle of human family building that Uttamapishti talked about. Date Grove is food production. The clay pits represent manufacturing industry. And the temple, spiritual and intellectual life. And it's very interesting that it's only half as big as the other portions of the city. There's a quote from Tolstoy there, but I won't go into that, I don't think. We don't need Tolstoy at this time of the evening, do we? Perhaps we do, I don't know. But I left the slide out that refers to. So Uruk's expanse is the sum of human life, and what Gilgamesh is telling Ur-Shanabi, he's come home, he's done his bit, he's exhausted, he's stopped, Anich Ur-Shubshuch, tired but at peace. Nothing more in his life is going to happen. He tells his companion, go up onto the wall of Uruk and observe there the city. And what do you see? You see human life. And the curtain comes down. And that's it. The poet is saying, yes, individuals go on their great quests. Sometimes they get what they want. More often, they don't get what they want. And all of them have to come to terms with the great fact of human life, which is human death. All of us. But there is another life of humans that is not individual. The life of humans that is communal. And we must remember that Babylonia is not a modern Western country instilled with the notions of the freedom of the individual that so inculcate our culture. Our culture is about the individual, the rights of the individual, the place of the individual. I think Babylonia was a more Asian place. It was more, the idea was, we're a community. We belong as part of that community. We have to act within that community. And what this poet is saying is, the individual is a mayfly who dies without trace. But human life, as represented by the city, where you can see all human life, goes on forever. So I think we have got, then, a message from the poem. I don't think the poem was created to give us that message, but I think the interest of the last poet of Gilgamesh was very much in using the story of Gilgamesh as a vehicle for understanding the human condition. And out of it, then we get this idea coming very strongly that what the individual does is not important. The important thing is the community, the society of human beings. And I think it's this, not only this idea, but also all the other ideas in the poem about what it is to be human as opposed to being an animal, what it is to be human as opposed to being a god, what it is to be a king. All these ideas demonstrate a great intellect at work who knows how to embed thoughts about the human condition into a great story drawn from folklore. And this, I think, explains why the great epic of Gilgamesh, 4,000 years old, when it was rediscovered and became known generally to more than Assyriologists in the early 20th century, it took off and took on a life of its own and has been the inspiration of artists and musicians and librettists and dramatists and poets who have not stayed faithful to the epic of Gilgamesh, but created Gilgamesh among us. And of course, Assyriologists hate this because we think we are the gatekeepers of the epic of Gilgamesh. And if you are going to engage with the epic of Gilgamesh, you should do it through our work. But of course, it's too late. The cat got out of the bag a long time ago. Thank you very much for listening.
This is a difficult act to follow. I'm Peter Machinist, one of the local residents. And with really great thanks and admiration for this discerning lecture that Andrew George has just given us, I make bold to offer a few remarks. They have to do with the interplay of kingship and immortality in the standard Akkadian version of the Gilgamesh epic. For me, the epic moves through a number of stages in which immortality may be conceived, only to reconfigure, even to undermine, and so to reject them one by one. Let me be more specific. The story begins, as we've heard, with a prologue that refers to the wall of Uruk that Gilgamesh constructed and the city of Uruk itself. And then in a Neo-Assyrian version on a tablet found at Nimrud, with a further reference to the tablet box, Akkadian Pishanu, deposited at the base of the wall with a text about Gilgamesh's exploits. But at that point in the story, the significance of the wall and the tablet with respect to immortality remains fully to be disclosed. Moving on, the story focuses on the great adventures of Gilgamesh and his buddy Enkidu in defeating and killing Humbaba, the monster guarding the cedar forest, and then killing the bull of heaven. But if these achievements were intended to win Gilgamesh and Enkidu a kind of deathless fame, they are quickly compromised by the disaster that follows with the goddess Ishtar. Later comes Gilgamesh's heroic journey to find the flood hero Utanapishtim in order to gain the personal immortality that the latter had been awarded by the gods. But here too, as we've heard, the end is in failure. And the failure is only compounded by a second defeat, namely of Gilgamesh's ability to hold on to the consolation prize of a plant that would rejuvenate him. To be sure, at the end of the basic story of the epic, that is, at the end of Tablet 11, we've seen the scene of the wall of Uruk and of the city itself returns. And this reappearance of the wall and the city, after their mention at the very beginning of the epic, reveals their significance, for they look like the answer to the running issue of immortality. Immortality presented now not as a personal deathlessness, but as the survival of the physical structure that in this instance Gilgamesh leaves behind. Yet even this answer is not a final one. Indeed, it is undermined, and in two ways. First, it's followed by an additional tablet in the first millennium standard version of the epic, namely Tablet 12. This offers a picture of the underworld from the mouth of Enkidu, who's now in it, a picture anticipated by Enkidu's second dream in Tablet 7, rather broken at this point. In this picture, the dead like Enkidu do survive, sort of, in a kind of afterlife. But the place in which they dwell, the underworld, is horrific, too awful to endure, let alone to contemplate, and so completely undesirable. The underworld, in short, is hardly a solution to the question of immortality. Second, if the reappearance of the wall and the city of Uruk at the end of Tablet 11 forces us back to the wall and Uruk at the beginning of Tablet 1, that return, at least in the Nimrud Neo-Assyrian version of Tablet 1, does not stop with the wall, but takes us, as we have seen, to the tablet box at the base of the wall. Inside, the tablet of Gilgamesh's exploits now gains a new significance, for its contents show that it is not just any account, but as colleagues of ours, Piotr Michałowski and Christopher Walker, have proposed, it's nothing less than the Gilgamesh epic itself. In other words, according to this Neo-Assyrian version, it is not simply the wall and city of Uruk that constitute Gilgamesh's immortality. That immortality is ultimately to be sought in the survival of the story about the search for immortality, which is the Gilgamesh epic. The epic, thus, here with some genuflection to Shakespeare, is about itself and implicitly its survival, its immortality. And yet even this is not the end, for we must now ask, what kind of immortality does this epic about an epic represent? It is certainly not the personal one that Gilgamesh seeks. And if the epic stands as an impersonal immortality, then what it offers, what it is consumed by, is but the fruitless search for a happy personal survival. Even more, if at the end of the epic story we are brought back to the beginning, it is only to start this fruitless search all over again. Thus, a continuous feedback loop that leads nowhere, a veritable Groundhog Day with Gilgamesh, none other than Bill Murray. Two conclusions, I think, can be drawn from this analysis. The first is that the quest for the meaning of immortality in the Gilgamesh epic is a continuous one across the history of the composition of the epic, moving through the successive versions of the Akkadian epic, as each of these versions added to, qualified, even subverted the views of the versions that had come before. The second conclusion is that taken as a whole, this quest for meaning throws real doubt on kingship, as represented by Gilgamesh, and immortality, or put otherwise, on kingship and divinity, thus on divine kingship. The background here was brilliantly illuminated by the late William Moran of Harvard's Near Eastern Department, one of the great connoisseurs of the Gilgamesh epic. In a letter to me several decades ago, and I haven't found this in his published studies, but someone may know of it. In this letter, he argued that the epic, beginning with its old Babylonian Akkadian version, was intended to sound the death knell of the tradition of divine kingship as exemplified by the old Akkadian kings from Naram Sin and the Ur-3 kings from Shulgi. And that appears to me absolutely right. The Gilgamesh epic in sum is not only an epic about itself, but an epic that undermines itself. Thank you.
Hi, I'm David Damrosch from Comparative Literature. As we can see, in Andrew George, we have not only the world's greatest authority on Gilgamesh, but also someone of great literary insight and poetic sensibility. And I think, really, Andrew, you don't need to despair on behalf of the archaeologists, because as you yourself show us, we moderns need your work in order to understand the text and get the most out of it. And I think also understanding its message today, it helps a lot to understand as best we can what it meant to ancient audiences, so far as we can reconstruct that. And to build on Peter Machinist's discussion of kingship in Gilgamesh, I thought I would talk about Enkidu, particularly in that pivotal episode of the Cedar Forest. And if we go back to what we have from ancient Near East, in particular the incredible finds in Assyria, Nineveh, where the best preserved tablets of Gilgamesh are found, we can learn a lot. This expedition to get cedar was a major economic and political activity of ancient monarchs. You needed good lumber, and it was hard to find in Mesopotamia. You had to go someplace. As one irritated builder wrote to Sargon II in a letter that's preserved, the second-rate logs we have here are quite plentiful, but truly none of them will do for the job. They're of fir, and they're much too thin. I've tried them, but I've rejected them. If they'd been of cedar, I would have used them. So what does this writer do? He covers his ass. The next thing, he instructs the king. Now, what are my lord the king's orders? If the king orders that these fir logs should be used, let my lord the king write specifically, and I will duly comply and give them over to the accounting of the palace superintendent. So if the ceiling falls down, his ass is covered. That's the basic point. So what you need is cedar logs. And for 1,000 years, monarchs praised themselves for going first to Western Persia and subsequently to Lebanon to get the goods. Gudi of Lagash, 200 years ago, makes a path into the Cedar Mountains, which nobody entered before. He cut its cedars with great axes. So Gilgamesh is in a long tradition here of doing what a monarch has to do. That's the imperial context of the quest for lumber. And this would be a special interest to any monarchs among the audience. But most of the audience, let's say in Nineveh, wouldn't be themselves royalty. They would be members of the court. They would be scribes, administrators, bureaucrats, advisors to the king. And for them, a much more direct role model, conveyor of a message is Enkidu. He's more like us, a professional managerial class. And what we see in the Cedar Forest episode, and again in the Ishtar episode, is that Enkidu progressively fails in his role as the king's companion and counselor. He should be restraining the headstrong Gilgamesh from going and attacking Humbaba, who is protected by the gods, who's set there by the great god Enlil. The wise men of his town say, don't do this. Enkidu himself says, yeah, we shouldn't really do this, but the headstrong king insists. Enkidu reluctantly agrees. And then Gilgamesh has a series of warning dreams. The gods send one dream after another saying, you really don't want to do this. And Gilgamesh doesn't know what to make of these dreams, in which he's overwhelmed by a volcano, he's assaulted by a wild bull, a ferocious lion-headed eagle, an axe falls on him. His flesh is frozen with fear, and he asks Enkidu, what do all these dreams mean? And this is where Enkidu sets his own path downwards. He falls into the classic temptation of an autocrat's advisor. He tells Gilgamesh what he knows the king wants to hear. And in a series of completely ridiculous interpretations of the dream, he says, oh, well, they're going to bind the wings of the eagle-headed lion, the lion-headed eagle. Gilgamesh himself must be the powerful bull, even though the bull is attacking him in the dream, completely contrary to fact. When they reach the cedar forest, Enkidu becomes increasingly rash in his actions, and he's ruthless when they've captured Humbaba. The ogre pleads for mercy, saying he'll give them lavish gifts, and adding that he's protected by the great god Enlil, so watch out. But having procured the desired timber and the glory of the victory, Gilgamesh is inclined to spare Humbaba. And this is a real political issue. What do you do with a conquered group? Do you destroy them, or do you co-opt them? And he's inclined to spare him, but Enkidu intervenes. Instead of releasing their captive, Enkidu says they should murder him on the spot. As for Enlil's likely anger, that is simply reason to act quickly. They should achieve a fait accompli ahead of the news cycle, before the gods can hear. As he says to Gilgamesh, finish him, slay him, do away with his power before Enlil the Foremost hears what we did. Establish forever a fame that endures, how Gilgamesh slew ferocious Humbaba. Gilgamesh follows Enkidu's advice and cuts off Humbaba's head, but not before the ogre has delivered a fearsome curse. Humbaba says, may the pair of them not grow old together. None shall bury Enkidu beside Gilgamesh, his friend. So in developing the old adventure tale that goes back to Sumerian times of Gilgamesh and Humbaba, the epic poet has fashioned a resonant portrayal of the pressures facing a willful king's counselors, whether it is Gilgamesh and Enkidu or Colin Powell and George W. Bush. It goes on and on, telling the king what they want to hear. Enkidu progressively fails to measure up to the task, and his death will be the result. So from the point of view of many of the poem's Near Eastern audience, as far as we could tell, let's say in Nineveh, where Ashurbanipal commissioned a copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the one with his name on it that you saw, if they listened to recital of the epic in the flickering torchlight of a banquet in the palace of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, the Epic of Gilgamesh is only partly a tale of great king's heroism and his quest for immortality. For Ashurbanipal's counselors and advisors, the Epic of Gilgamesh was equally a cautionary tale, the tragedy of Enkidu.
I follow with some aspects of the visual culture of ancient Mesopotamia, but also, as with David just now, leading forward, and as Andrew concluded, leading forward to our perception of ancient Mesopotamia. You will have noted that in the title to Andrew's first slide and then his thank you last slide, that he called the Epic of Gilgamesh the modern the modern piece of Babylonian poetry. And I would remind everybody in the audience as an archaeologist that it may have been the masterpiece of Babylonian poetry, but remember how incomplete the archaeological record is and the limitation of places we've excavated. And I'd like to leave open the possibility that other comparable epics may have existed, and or that epics that entered into the vocabulary would have been part of a Babylonian experience or an Assyrian experience of their own literary world. In that respect, we have nothing quite similar to the Homeric epics or to the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, to the extent that the cultures that produced them represented them and illustrated them over and over and over again. And it's challenging, but it's not so difficult to make comparable statements about the literary tradition and the visual tradition. With the Epic of Gilgamesh, however, it's more challenging. There are a number of images that seem to refer to the epic visually, and I include 3 of them here because they appear on different media. That is, clay plaques is the upper left, one of which in color Andrew showed earlier in Berlin, and the other two, a cylinder seal at the bottom left and a stone relief from the site of Tel Halaf in northern Syria of the first millennium. So we're going from the second millennium BC at the upper left to the first millennium BCE in the bottom right. However, one of the things I found in looking for artistic representations, so-called identifiable with the epic, is the degree to which the same illustrations are used over and over and over again. And that's precisely because there are a limited number of such objects that can be related to the direct iconography scenes in representation in the text, and then connected to representation visually. Now, many of those objects that represent happen to be clay plaques, and I show you a view of the Louvre current installation of clay plaques in a vitrine at the left. But then some of the kinds of images that we have, as Andrew has shown us partly, of faces that seem to reflect the text indicating Humbaba, because we're told that his face is not unlike entrails, unless you would translate it differently these days, and one sees those very weird lines that look like no human face, but seem to coil around on themselves and possibly therefore represent the figure of Humbaba as he appears. Now the fact is, however, that one would wonder why the enemy, as it's called, of the epic heroes, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, shows up individually on single plaques. And the only thing I can come up with that is that it's not unlike the Gorgon head in Greek tradition, to the extent that once dominated, then it becomes apotropaic in that it has its own power, and Humbaba can be used against one's enemy like the evil eye, not unlike the Gorgon head on shields in the classical tradition. Nevertheless, the fact is that these epics-related images do appear in popular culture in less expensive clay plaques is important for us to think about. And then Andrew did show not only these heads, as I just showed you, but also this figure that's bandy-legged and seems to have another entrail-like head on him in a clay plaque, so that there are aspects of the Humbaba, if it is he, that have awkward contorted bits of body or bowed legs that don't necessarily appear in the literary tradition. Now, at the same time, we do find individual plaques that once again get replicated over and over again as illustrations of the text, because it may or may not, but seems to represent Enkidu and the Bull of Heaven in the combat. So that there are a couple of images, this one in particular is one I'm very fond of, that may have walked out of the epic, but there is no narrative that gives us that part of the story, just the excerpt as you see it here. Now, at the same time, if you notice the figure that is going up against the upside-down bull, he seems to have wild curls in his hair and could be therefore a visual reflection of the wild man, Enkidu, who is not the king of Uruk or even the prince of Uruk before he comes back to become the king of Uruk, and ultimately represents the duality between the civilized man, Gilgamesh, and the wild man, Enkidu. In fact, there are many figures that seem to replicate that wild man with 3 hair curls that are doing things quite different in showing a flowing vase of abundance and not necessarily tied to imagery, verbal imagery in the epic. So we do not have guarantees that somebody who has 3 curls is always already Enkidu, but rather can represent a wild figure, as our colleague Franz Wichermann has discussed, in terms of a particular kind of heroic figure, but not necessarily walking out of the epic. Therefore, we come to that very first slide I showed you, in that it is surprising to me that when you go through the repertoire of images that seem to replicate aspects of scenes in the epic, the Old Babylonian period, as above here, seems to be better represented than the later periods of the Neo-Assyrian and the later North Syrian of the first millennium, when the epic itself has been constructed into this extraordinary literary composition with a beginning and a 12th tablet end that's almost symmetrical with what goes on as activity in the beginning, and reminds me of Siabush and the Marduk hymn that he talked about 1,000 years ago when we both were young, where that literary structure does include a beginning and an end that reflects then the narrative that goes in between. And yet, for the era in which Nimrod and the texts of the Assyrian version and Babylon and the later texts, where the text itself is complete or relatively complete, we have relatively few images. They may reflect the death of Humbaba and or Gilgamesh and Enkidu opposed to a monster-like creature that they are slaying jointly, as here and there in the periphery of northern Syria. But again, we have very few images of the era that produce the finished poem. And so what Andrew's lectures last night and today have inspired me to do is to go back to that old Babylonian period and look at what's happening in the early redaction of the epic, rather than in the later redaction of the epic that has its own agenda. And there I would argue with some of my Assyriological colleagues that the agenda of man's place in the human condition in the universe may be different in the first millennium from when the epic started out. And that the agenda of the epic when it began could have more to do with the ruler, potential ruler, being tempered by life and experience to come home and be a good ruler, precisely because state and state formation was important, and that quest of the individual with respect to death and to life could be an adaptation of the attitude toward human existence in the first millennium, not necessarily going all the way back to the role of Uruk in early years of state formation in the fourth millennium and the third millennium BCE. Now, all of that is a way of saying that I do have one way in which we could make some progress on the relationship between the epic and the and imagery. And that comes out of a course that Peter Machinist and I taught jointly on representation in text and image at Harvard before he retired and I retired. And I bring you to the great stela of Naram Sin of Agade in the Akkadian period, when there may well have been earlier incarnations of the epic already existing. And that has to do with the vocabulary that's used to describe the hero king in words in the epic, and in particular, those terms that show up over and over and over again about the able ruler being full of grace, well-built and constructed, alluring and radiant, those attributes that show up verbally, but then are applied in visual imagery later on, consistent with our notions of beauty. That, as Andrew was saying today, many of poetic lines show up in two opposite lines, verses show up in two opposite lines, that very often attributes that are associated with auspiciousness, with beauty, with allure, end up as paired couplets in poetry, but also end up as paired aspects of attributes in the visual repertoire. And in this respect, Naram Sin, I think, has them all, in that he's well-formed, he's full of allure, and he does all those things that a good ruler is supposed to do to radiate those aspects of rule that one wants to take away with one in terms of being a subject to the object who is the king. So I would say that the epic in its later form can resonate backwards in time as well as forwards in time, but has a lot to teach us. Thank you.